Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor. Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. This is going to be awesome. My compatriot, Dr. Brian Lenskis, is not here today. He was so bummed out. He's such a huge fan of Paul Thacker's work, and he's such a huge fan of the chronic Lyme movement, and he would have been so happy to be here today with Kris Newby. But I want to start off by saying we have two important guests. Paul Thacker is an award-winning journalist. You probably remember him from Senate hearings where he basically investigated Avandia and looked into the crimes of GlaxoSmithKline. But more recently, he's had an award-winning journalist with, I want to say, some of the most hottest hitting, most controversial issues regarding COVID and COVID pharmaceutical, I guess, corruption, really. He's been censored across all platforms, and despite that, he keeps pressing on. He has an awesome Substack. Remind me the Substack name. It's Disinformation Chronicles, right?
Disinformation Chronicle. And the reason why I called that is because I'd started off originally doing issues on disinformation and climate change and then chemicals. Then I went to go work for Grassley, and I started seeing the same thing in pharmaceuticals. And I was like, this is the same program across all these, like medicine, toxicology, whatever. And no one's talking about, doctors are talking about pharmaceuticals. These guys are talking about this. Everyone's talking about climate change, and like, I just think people need to come together and realize like the way this whole, program operates.
Yeah, basically we're talking about regulatory capture. And then you wrote this post and really, as a doctor with disenfranchised patients, chronic Lyme patients, I have seen regulatory capture at play for a long time. And then you put me you opened my eyes to a book called BITTEN by Kris Newby, who's an award-winning author, a science communicator from Stanford, and a chronic Lyme patient herself, if I'm not mistaken, who overcame chronic Lyme without much help from the CDC. So I think we have three people here who probably hate the CDC the most, or at least, criticize the CDC the most. Now, I don't want to say hate, but I think we're all very attuned to the issues of regulatory capture in our environment right now. And so I wanted to start off with the hottest topic, which is COVID. And well, before we go there, I was going to do a little deep dive into bioterrorism, because I think one of the issues we face in our society when prominent scientists posed the idea that lab leak is possible, that governments may be conducting research on viruses, and it's possibility that this virus came from a lab, there was staunch opposition to this. And so I just wanted to give our listeners a brief sort of understanding of the history of bioterrorism. It's been used by governments literally since 14th century BC. One of the first times we used bioterrorism was when they took tularemia in a bunch of rams and literally sent them off to their opposing army. I mean, the Spanish in the 1800s, the 1400s, they literally mixed leprosy patients' blood in with the wine that they sold to the French. We've heard, there's some controversy around, smallpox being distributed in blankets. I think that's been debunked, but these ideas of bioterrorism have been used basically since the dawn of existence. I think there were Confederates during the American Civil War. They literally had, yellow fever mixed clothes, and they sent them to the Union troops. This is not anything new. It's been done for millennium. And I think people shouldn't view it as conspiracy, bioterrorism as conspiracy. In World War I, a bunch of different gases were used. In World War II, the same thing. And in a modern era, it's like people forgot There was anthrax just like 2 decades ago. So
Right.
bioterrorism isn't some conspiracy theory. It's something that plays out every day. And we should mention in the 1970s, the Tuskegee trials, where literally the CDC, from the early, I think, 1930s all the way to 1970, literally injected syphilis into minority populations. So it's not like bioterrorism is some hush hush topic. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a reality, and it's something that we should probably talk about openly. So I wanted to start with COVID. Paul, is COVID bioterrorism? What did was it bioterrorism?
So what I can tell you is, if you go back and look, and this is kind of why I even got interested in Kris's work, Kris Newby's book and her work, was because, as I've for a variety of reasons, but one was people had told me that, when I first started looking into this issue of biowarfare and COVID, the first thing that happened was when this virus was, started a pandemic, there was a lot of concern of, just, hey, they're studying these viruses in Wuhan. And hey, it happened in Wuhan. Like, what a surprise. That's really crazy. It's just like, what I've told people is like, it's like finding out that the fire that burned down the city started in the backyard of the fire department. You're like, wow, that's weird. So people began asking questions about, like, how did this thing start? And we knew that there's a lab there, several labs actually in Wuhan. And we know that they were doing virus research where they were changing the genetics of these viruses to make them more deadly. They've been denying this, but we know it's been going on. And it's been happening also in American laboratories, although it's also, we're told that it's not happening. And what they've done is they've basically made these semantic changes and drowned this stuff in these very technical terms. And what I was, where they call it actually biodefense research. And so what I was saying is that's silly. That's like calling an M16 assault rifle an M16 defense rifle. Like, it's the same rifle, you don't get to like semantic change it, it is the same thing. And, and we've not been having honest discussions about this. And let me tell you, like, the things that are most suspicious, this make us think that this virus may have happened because of a lab accident in Wuhan. It's not necessarily the direct evidence, although we just had a hearing earlier this week with some intelligence officials who were talking about other information that I can't discuss, but it's still classified. But I've heard this, people testified to this effect, the former DNI, that there is more evidence that is still classified in the classified material, pointing even more at this Wuhan Institute of Virology as the focus of how this pandemic started. So let me tell you, like, what the evidence we really have, to me, which I think is the most interesting evidence. And the way I've described this as, if I'm talking to a friend of mine, I'm explaining to her that her husband is cheating on her and why I think that's happened. And what I'd have to tell her is I'd say, look, I don't have photos of your husband in bed with this woman. Here's what I do know. I do know that he said he went camping a month ago with John. I spoke to John. John told me they didn't go camping. So I don't know where he was that weekend when he disappeared. I don't have evidence that he's sleeping with his ex-girlfriend, Angela, but he said that, like, he hasn't spoken to Angela in years. He was texting Angela just 3 days ago. I saw the text. So I don't know what's going on and what he's doing, but I think he's cheating on you with Angela.
Well, let's talk about
lying about things.
Let's talk about this because you've posted in your Substack, which, if you're listening to this, please sign up for a Substack right now. The Disinformation Chronicles. Follow them on Twitter. What interests me about some of the things you've uncovered is how staunchly our sort of, Collins, Fauci, how they really wanted to suppress this idea of a lab leak. And I think that's sort of what you're talking about, like the text messages with the ex-girlfriend, right?
Right. I'll tell you what we have, the evidence of the cover-up, right? So, like, this is a thing, like, this is what I'd be telling someone, like, I don't have evidence of him in bed with her, but I know he's lying about what he's doing, and then it involves a woman. So like, I don't know. So here's what we know about the evidence of the cover-up about what happened in Wuhan. There were 3 papers published in the academic literature early on in 2020, all misdirecting everyone to say that if you say this virus started from a lab accident in Wuhan, that's a conspiracy theory. So what do we have? On February 19th, a bunch of scientists published a statement in the Lancet that claimed a possible lab accident is a conspiracy theory. Here's what we found out later, almost a year later. That letter in the Lancet was orchestrated by Peter Daszak, who runs a nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance that is funded by the NIH and that works directly with Shizheng Li at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There was no disclosure of that when that letter was published. The Lancet has gone back and has now added the conflict of interest sort of a description for Peter Daszak. I say it now reads like a Russian novel. It's so long right now. I've never seen a COI statement like this before. It now says all these different things. The Lancet shut down their COVID commission, which is looking into the origin, because the people that Peter Daszak brought on to look into this issue, they all had ties to Wuhan, or they were all being funded by EcoHealth Alliance. So that's one example on February 19th. On February 26th, we have a bunch of virologists publish a commentary in Emerging Microbes and Infections, again claiming it's a conspiracy theory to say that the pandemic started in a lab. This became the first or third most heavily cited study published in Taylor and Francis that year. They were like, they got an email about this, like, your thing went crazy, right? We then find out later that that commentary was partially ghostwritten by Shizheng Li of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The emails are there. We also know that Ralph Barrick, who's a virologist at UNC, works on gain of function research. He also helped to ghostwrite it. He even said in the emails that I quoted, please, I don't want my name attached to this. He says this, and then you can see below like track changes of what he's done on this. So this is a second example of it. The final one is March 17th of 2020, right? So we're in the 3rd month now of the pandemic starting. We have these scientists published a paper in Nature Medicine that concluded that a lab accident was not plausible. Now, the emails come out later. We find out that when they first started discussing this paper, the lead authors, Christian Anderson, who's a virologist at Scripps University, they had this long conversation with Peter Daszak, with Francis Collins, Anthony Fauci, and Jeremy Farrar, who funds the Wellcome Institute, which is one of the biggest grant-making institutes in biomedicine on the planet. And they first thought, hey, we think this thing was bioengineered. They then did a 180, wrote this piece in Nature Medicine. As it's been accepted, Anderson sends it back to Fauci, Collins, and Farrar and says, thanks for your advice and leadership on this paper. Then there is no disclosure at all of their involvement in the paper, right? After it's published, Francis Collins goes and publishes on the NIH leadership blog, independent scientists have found blah, blah, blah. There's a White House press conference where the President Trump is asked about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Anthony Fauci steps to the dais and says, well, we have this independent paper showing that, that this couldn't have possibly happened. This whole thing was orchestrated. So the question becomes, why did they need to orchestrate all these papers and plant them in the literature to confuse the scientific community, to confuse science writers? And there's a couple possibilities. They knew what was going on, right? Or they knew, because we have emails that Fauci was told in January of 2020 that he was funding research at Wuhan, that it involved gain of function research. And Fauci's just like any bureaucrat, like, whoa, this could, like, people start looking at Wuhan, they realize I'm funding them, this makes me look bad. So we don't know why they were covering it up, but we know there was a cover up.
So I want to talk about this because I know Francis Collins sent an email to Fauci literally saying this idea needs to be, dealt with, right?
Right.
So,
right.
Help me understand, because I don't see a plausible reason why the heads of these healthcare organizations wouldn't be looking for cures at the time, treatments, running trials. Like, there's so many other things that they could be doing, but it seems like so much energy looking back at their emails was towards sort of a cover up and, or to at least the best case scenario, they wanted to craft the narrative. The
Right.
worst case scenario.
Yeah, and I see the same playbook happening beginning in 1980 or 78 with Lyme disease. So it's like a tale as old as time, and it's the exact same playbook. But keep going, Paul.
Well, I wanted to come back to this. I wanted to come back to this because there's something.
Wait, let me just tell you, Tro, what happened. Here's what's going on. Okay. The reason why they were doing this is because the vast majority of people don't know this, but the NIAID, the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, right? What do you hear? Allergies and infectious diseases, right? So it makes you like, oh, they're like studying influenza. Oh, they're like, why does my kid have asthma? Like, you know, what do we do? The vast majority of people do not know that a big part of what they do there at NIAID is biodefense. That is essentially a biodefense research institute housed within the NIH. And think about this. What if when Fauci was being called or quoted in the New York Times, he was quoted as President Biden's main advisor on biodefense? We would be having very different conversations about this. This all began, as you said, about anthrax. This started 20 years ago. After we had 9/11, after we had the anthrax incidents, the NIAID totally changed their portfolio and began doing all this biodefense research. Now, at the time, right, Fauci was very happy to talk about his biodefense research. He went and he talked about this before Congress. There's articles about it at the time. There was even a letter in, I believe, 2006 with like 50, 60 researchers very upset about the total change of focus at NIAID. Very few people there talk today about the fact that that's what this research group does. They still think like, you know, oh, it's like he got a cold, or, oh, how do we deal with asthma stuff? They're doing biodefense research there today. And that you cannot discuss that when we're basically dealing with a pandemic that started, you know, in a city where there's a lab that's being funded by the NIH to study this virus, right? That exists 1,000 miles away in a whole another part of China.
I think we have to look at the motives, which is why would anybody be thinking about, crafting language about its origins when, you know, we knew how sort of deadly it was in the elderly population at that time. You know, why wasn't there a different focus? I think the other thing that I want to tie this into Kris's work, which is, you know, the CDC looks very sort of shady. Then, NIH looks very shady, and we don't even know the extent of their financial conflicts of interest. And I think that that's also a problem, right? The NIH has, patents their findings, their researchers patent their findings, and then they license these off to pharma, and we don't know how much money these researchers have made from this pandemic, right? Which I think is another huge glaring conflict of interest that we don't know about.
Right. So Paul helped get through the Sunshine Act, which physicians have to disclose their conflicts of interest, but there is like a 1.5 year delay time, and this pandemic has moved really quickly. So there's a lag time on when you can do that. And also, for example, the CDC, which was founded as a quasi-military organization after World War II, and their main function was to look for suspicious bioterrorist outbreaks. So I think in CDC, there's this DNA of secrecy that carries on today. So we have just a lot of conflicts, a lot of So for example, in Lyme disease, a lot of the original CDC people, when Lyme was discovered, were on the patents for test kits and vaccines. And they could, at the time I was researching this for my documentary Under Our Skin, they could earn $140,000 a year on patent royalties. But nowadays they won't even let that information out. So it's very frustrating if you're trying to investigate motive.
There was something that you said, Kris, that stuck my eyes out, that it really stuck out to me, which is that we don't know exactly the involvement of the CDC. And this is exactly how I feel when it comes to COVID but we know that they're doing shady things.
Right.
We know they're doing, and so this blueprint that Paul, that you're talking about right now, this regulatory capture you've seen play out in other industries, and now really playing out in the public health landscape. Kris, you saw this 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I mean, so, and I've seen you lecture on this, on some of the sort of shenanigans. So can you, maybe now we could just turn the page from COVID and sort of the COVID, the questions that the COVID response have led us to think about, back to Lyme disease, right? Back to Lyme disease. And I wanted to talk about, there was a key character in your book, and, tell us about Willie. Tell us about Willie.
Yeah, so Willy Burgdorfer, Swiss-American scientist, he came over in 1951 to be the go-to person for tick-borne disease research, because after World War II, our military people saw that Germany was working on bioweapons that involved insects, and Japan, so he was called in to be the expert on that, to really develop weaponized fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes. So you would put germs in them, crude gain of function, put germs inside those insects. You'd look for an insect that you could drop on an enemy and it wouldn't arouse suspicion. And it would be like 8-legged or 6-legged soldiers. And you'd release them, you'd drop them from planes or whatever, spray them from buoys, and it would infect a population, and it would weaken a population, and then it would be easier to send soldiers and take over infrastructure.
and there's evidence of this in Cuba, right? If I'm not mistaken, was there some evidence of this that was done?
Yeah, so I found a participant in a CIA dark ops program. He had a box of infected ticks, and he dropped it on Cuban sugarcane workers in 1962. And that was just part of the 100 assassination attempts to weaken the Castro government, the communist government, and to assassinate Cuba. And the thought was sugar was their main cash crop, and let's make all the sugarcane workers sick, and then they wouldn't be able to produce and earn money. And the people would rise up and throw Castro out, which that obviously did not happen. But anyways, if you tie it to the COVID incident, I always say that, like, the Lyme disease was an epic failure of CDC and NIH, and it like put cracks in the dam, but it was a slow roll. There weren't a lot of body bags with Lyme disease, but COVID just broke the dam because it just ripped through so quickly.
Well, no, I disagree. Lyme is so devastating. I have a patient who, after Lyme, her diabetes got significantly worse. Insulin resistance got significantly worse, despite, standard treatments, which, let's talk a little bit about Lyme. Lyme typically starts from the bite of an Ixodes tick, and it's transmitting I don't want to say bacteria, it's more like a virus-like bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi, named after Willie, which did not know. We learn about this in medical school. So that tick, when it latches on long enough, it transmits this bacterium, this virus-like bacterium, and that basically spreads throughout the body and can deposit in multiple organs. So untreated, Lyme can affect the heart, can affect the brain, can affect multiple different organs. Now, so it is like the perfect, sort of bio weapon. And so tell us a little bit about the history of Lyme.
Yeah, so like with COVID, there was an official story, and the official story was in 1982, Willy Burgdorfer was sent out to investigate why all these people had been getting sick around New York and Long Island and Lyme, Connecticut. And Yale had been working on it for about 10 years and they hadn't figured it out. They thought it was a virus. So Willie got samples of blood from that area and ticks from that area, and he dissected them, and lo and behold, he discovered that it was the spirochete, and nobody else had noticed the spirochete, which is Lyme, the Lyme bacterium. And joy, NIH saved the day. They solved it when all the Yale scientists couldn't solve it, and game over. Oh, and it can be cured by 2 weeks of doxycycline. So that was the official story. So when I started investigating it, first of all, it was a documentary, and it was just a weird situation, because normally when you have a new germ that is discovered, people go, oh, this is horrible. Write about me. We're going to solve this. We're heroes. But there was just a closed door. There was, I had scientists who were there at the discovery hanging up on me. We couldn't get any CDC or NIH official on screen to just talk about the germ and the mechanism of action. So it was just strange. There were rumors of bioweapons, et cetera. So it was just weird. So we got Willie finally in an interview right at the end of our filming for this documentary. And just as we're setting up the lights and camera, there's a pounding on the door. It's someone from the BioLevel 4 and lab in his town, and he's a scientist, high-ranking scientist. He says, I have to sit on this. I've been told by the highest levels. And Willie was retired for years by then. And the director said, no, you can't come in. This is a private interview. Like, what's going on? So we knew there was control there. And at that point, Willie was the first person who was in the know who said, yeah, Lyme disease can be chronic, which CDC and NIH still will not admit that. And it's especially damaging to the developing neurological systems of children. And so we finished the interview. He said a lot of damning things about the NIH scientists, like they perform experiments like the treatment trial where they know the outcome before they even finish the experiment, which is highly unethical. And then we turned off the cameras, we were packing up, and Willie goes, I didn't tell you everything. And so that was a nagging, unfinished business from the film. And then when I heard about the Cuban tick dropper, and I started researching for the book. And what I did with the book is I said, well, this official story that this organism that nobody else noticed, and it was what was making people sick, it just doesn't make sense. So I started doing the backstory. And that's when I realized there was this massive bug-borne weapons program and biological weapons program that was as big as the Manhattan Project. It involved contracts with 52 universities, all branches of the military, hundreds of open field tests with ticks and fleas and mosquitoes and diseases that can be spread by ticks, like tularemia that was used as a bioweapon in ancient times. And that's when you start seeing sort of the mechanisms of a cover-up.
It's interesting. I want to stick to tick-borne illnesses, and maybe you can help me understand, because I'm conspiratorial by nature. I like entertaining sort of some of these ideas. And I interviewed once a large university, a worldwide well-known university's bioethicist. And he was talking about ways of creating population change. And he said, well, what if we could create a vaccine that made people allergic or not interested in eating meat? He posed this question. He said, what if we could do that? Right? And I said, well, maybe that already exists. There's the Lone Star tick transmits causes a illness to alpha-gal, which is basically an allergy to meat. This is something we have already that we've noticed in the medical field. And that's when it hit me that, these tick-borne illnesses can really be can be terrible biowarfare weapons by, sort of authoritarian or tyrannical regimes. So
Yeah.
tell us more about sort of more evidence that you uncovered, and tell us about the book.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the alpha-gal allergy, which is really devastating for the people who get it, because you can never eat red meat again, or you'll get anaphylactic shock and hives, and depending on how it manifests. What?
I've never even heard of this.
Yes.
Right. It only started in the 80s, which, knowing what I know about the nefarious history.
I thought you were being crazy, Tro. I was like, wait, what? It's like, no, like I thought you're like, this thing can happen. And she's like, no, then you're allergic. You can't. I'm like, oh, wait. Oh, so it's happening right now.
This is happening. This is happening right now. Alpha-gal is rising.
Yeah, mostly in the Great Lakes region. And I have a really good friend, Tim Opelia, who's done the deep dive, citizen scientist. So he has some great stories on that. But this is what?
So like, is this only like, are we talking about only beef, only pork, chicken? Like, what does this do exactly? Like, I'm sorry, like you're talking about, I have no clue what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's actually,
Doctor, it's mostly red meat, but
well, let's walk back. There's a certain tick called the Lone Star tick, right? And
which was weaponized. Okay.
Right, which holds a certain bacteria that causes your body to produce an immune response, and that immune response, so you become a bioreactor to that, right? And that immune response that you make now makes you allergic to certain proteins in beef, specifically beef.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
but let's say you go to the Subway sandwich shop and you order a fish sandwich, but they did ham or a beef sandwich before that. You'll get some molecules of the beef on your fish sandwich and you'll go into anaphylactic shock.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I did not know about this at all.
Yeah, not everybody is as you can develop anaphylaxis. Some people just develop a terrible, like hives and terrible sort of reactions to it. But it is and in fact, the lead bioethicists were thinking about this concept, right? And in this interview that I did on this podcast, he was thinking about this concept: where should we create a vaccine to make people allergic or deter them from eating meat? This was his question. And then we find out back in the 1980s, this is sort of the same type of thought processes used. And this is sort of what BITTEN goes into.
Right. So the most outrageous experiment that I heard about, which I think could have contributed to the illness that we call Lyme disease, is that the Lone Star ticks before the 60s was pretty much way in the South, Texas, below the Mason-Dixon line. But a very ambitious university researcher, Dr. Sonnenschein at Old Dominion University, got a bunch of government grants, the Army, the Atomic Energy Commission, to study the Lone Stars. And the Lone Stars are not as nice as deer ticks. They're very aggressive. They have rudimentary eyes, so they can swarm and stalk their prey. They carry a lot of the really deadly rickettsias, like spotted fever. So anyways, he took hundreds of thousands of these Lone Star ticks in Northern Virginia on the coast, on the Atlantic bird flyway zone. And he took the hundreds of thousands of them and made them radioactive. And he he would take a big swampy field and divide it into meter squares and put 1,000 ticks in each square, radioactive ticks in each square. And he'd do that, and then he'd go away for a month and he'd come back and he'd collect the ticks in each square in individual containers, and they would be radioactive. So he could take a Geiger counter and tell how far the ticks had spread in a month, 2 months, 3 months, a year. And then he would, he would measure that and then put them back in the square where he found them. So it was a completely open, uncontrolled experiment of these really aggressive non-native ticks that then were picked up by birds up the Atlantic coast. And then 2 years after he did this 3 years of uncontrolled Lone Star tick experiments, there was a huge outbreak of Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is only carried by these ticks, and people were dying on Long Island. So that was part of what we call Lyme disease. In the late 60s, there were people dying on Long Island of spotted fever. In Nantucket, there was this first-in-man cattle parasite that all of a sudden landed. Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and then there was Lyme arthritis. So you have 3 completely freaky frankengerms that showed up in the late 60s from different animal vectors. And so the question, the one vector was Dr. Sonnenschein from Virginia. One was maybe Plum Island cattle experiments. So no one before BITTEN had said, oh, this is weird. Like climate change couldn't cause 3 brand new germs to all of a sudden show up.
Right.
Just it's the same story as COVID. No one had asked those questions because the NIH and the CDC had wrapped up the story in 82. Oh, this epidemic is one and done.
Yeah, I think, you know, some of the problems also now that my patients with Lyme face is not, you know, some of them do get better. You know, we give prophylaxis to try to prevent the Lyme. In the case of a tick bite, we try to treat aggressively and early with the signs of a rash, but very few, but some patients develop chronic symptoms. Mm-hmm. And right now, and I think you've been open about that, if I'm not mistaken, that you had sort of symptoms for years, right? And took, and some patients require sort of, you know, off the beaten path treatment. And the CDC has always frowned upon this. In fact, the IDSA, which is the Infectious Disease Society, has always really frowned upon it. And yet we have so many people that have come to our practice with these medically unexplained symptoms post Lyme. So can you talk a little bit about sort of, you know, the controversy of chronic Lyme, and, you know, if you'd be willing to share some of your own sort of experience getting treatment?
Yeah, I mean, it took my husband and I, our family went to Martha's Vineyard which was number 2 state for Lyme disease in 2002. And we came back to California. We were sicker than we'd ever been. And it took us 10 doctors and $60,000 and a year to get diagnosed. Because for Lyme disease, there is no test that works in the first month when we were really sick. It's not reliable. And then the whole medical community has been told that Lyme disease is rare, easy to diagnose, treat, and cure. And like with both of us, we came down, we were sick on the same day, same symptoms, had been in the same place, but we were told for both of you to get Lyme disease would be like winning the lottery. And eventually, 6 months into our illness, I was told that we had a psychosomatic couples thing where I was jealous of my husband and I was just manifesting these symptoms and he was mirroring these symptoms. So, but no one, during that whole year, no one would test us for Lyme disease, even though
they said you're hallucinating earlier than they said maybe you need treatment and maybe you need testing. The
ironic thing is
that's authoritarian doctors. You know, this is authoritarian medicine. You know, this is something I've railed against. You know, that people don't want to take medically unexplained symptoms seriously. Doctors, if you can't explain something, they'd rather say, because it's easier for them to say you're crazy, rather than say, maybe there's something here, maybe you're suffering, maybe I got to figure something out.
Or what they can say is, maybe what's happening is our clinical specialty has scientific limitations, which all science does, and they just can't acknowledge that. Like, hey, medicine can only go so far, and we're going to know more in 40 years. But right now, what's going on with you, we can't explain. You know,
yeah, you're right. They can't do that. No, you're right. That doctors are very uncomfortable with medically unexplained symptoms, right? So here you are suffering. How did you ultimately get diagnosed? Because I know even Western blots, the CDC approach is different than some sort of other approaches?
Well, every doctor, all 10 doctors, I said, I think we might have Lyme. Can you test for Lyme? And they wouldn't test till Dr. 8 at Stanford. And then it came up positive, and he says, well, this is the first test, which is the ELISA. Well, that's positive, but that's not very reliable, so it doesn't mean anything. So then we just had to go on. I fired that. No, that doctor fired us because he says we don't have the tools to take care of you here. Later, when I got to know him at Stanford, he said it was because Stanford doesn't treat chronic Lyme. Those people are crazy. They think those people are crazy. So, but let's like go back. The central question that I've dealt with for 20 years now is, why are they treating this disease this way? And there's two parts to it. One was covered in the film, which is conflicts of interest, that everybody was really invested in the Lyme vaccine, the academic researchers, just much like COVID, and they were all into the vaccine and they didn't want to mess with cures. And a little bit into the research, they realized that Lyme disease is a bit like AIDS. You can't use a simple vaccine to prevent the disease. The organism itself has too many ways to evade the immune system. But once they're invested in it, and it's going to be their college fund or whatever, this vaccine trial money, then they ended up desensitizing the test so the vaccine trial would look better on paper. That's multiple journalists have come to that conclusion. And so now, 40 years later, we're stuck with a useless test, basically. And everybody knows it now. All the scientists admit it, but they won't change it because there's a new vaccine in the pipeline.
Well, I know that a lot of doctors who treat Lyme very aggressively, infectious disease doctors, they don't even use sort of the standard labs anymore. They use, much more labs that are higher in sensitivity, that are discordant from the CDC. And I've never seen that in any other condition. Like there aren't special labs that are more sensitive than the CDC's cutoffs, right? So which I find quite interesting.
Yeah, and they took out the two most sensitive proteins in the test because they were saying, it'll cross-react with the vaccine as far as test results. So the two most specific bands that tell you if you really have it are out of the test. So now they have this really high bar for you have to have 5 bands, protein bands, or 10 protein bands. But even if you have one really specific band, it's like, why can the doctors are saying you don't have Lyme disease, even though you have a very, very specific band on the test. And it's like being a little bit pregnant.
Bro, can you explain something? Because this is kind of like what actually got me interested in interviewing Kris in the first place, was being online and seeing people over and over again saying chronic Lyme is a conspiracy. And me just looking at this, I'm like, why are you guys saying why would you care if someone has a condition that's chronic? Why are you excited over that? What's your activism over that? I thought it was so weird. And that's what attracted me, because it's like, it doesn't matter if someone has this chronic disease or not. Why would you attack them for saying, hey, I have this chronic condition? And I just never, what is going on inside the medical profession with physicians? Because it's just bizarro to me. That's what attracted me to Kris in the first place, is trying to understand that.
That's an excellent question. And I think you're actually walking into a very, this is what I love about you, Paul, because you're trying to unify a problem here. And the problem is doctors don't think creatively. One, doctors are overworked, and we sort of absorb a message, and it's a top-down sort of messaging. So there's no such thing as chronic Lyme is taught to medical students, right? That your patient is experiencing something psychosomatic is literally part of the culture, right? So there's a culture that we know best. Science knows all. Fauci is faith. And, that there's an uncomfortableness with saying, I don't know. There's an uncomfortableness our profession has with saying, You know, I don't know the limitations of the tests I'm ordering. I don't know the limitation. Like there's a big time problem with ego, arrogance, and authoritarianism in medicine. Right.
You know, it's funny when you say that. There's a when I was working on the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, there was a very famous psychiatrist that was helping me understand like how conflicts of interest worked in medicine and everything. I mean, this guy, like, there was a big obituary on the New York Times when he died, one in BMJ, one in the New York Times. And right before he passed away a few years ago, you know, I was on the phone just talking to him. I just check in every 6 months or something like that. His wife had cancer. And I can't remember what she had exactly. And, you know, he's a psychiatrist, his wife, I can't remember what his wife did, a nurse or something like that. And so they went to treatment to the oncologist, and the oncologist, like, first thing they did is they downloaded all the RCTs on the particular cancer that she had. And they started going over it themselves, right? He's a psychiatrist, not an oncologist. They start going over the research, and then they go and they meet with the oncologist, and the oncologist says, well, like, we should do this, this, and this. And he told the oncologist, bullshit. I've read the research. I know kind of, you know, what really works and what the therapy is. And the guy said, okay, yeah, you're right. Like, let's try this, you know? And so it was just very weird, you know, because they were just like, what do we do? Do we do this treatment, or is like this it? And we're just going to do, like, we've got 3 years to live nice, you know? And that's what we have is our 3 years, you know? But he was just funny in the way he told me that he, as a psychiatrist, was able to essentially punk his wife's oncologist by pointing out, here's what the actual studies say. And the oncologist agreed.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you right now, doctors are uncomfortable with informed patients, right? We have, like, we're taught some, it's like a religion. It's become more like a religion than what it should be, which is open thinking, a desire to go and research, a desire to go and look up. You know, I'm one of those. I trained in a program where Lyme is rampant. I trained in the Yale system. Okay. Chronic Lyme is not a thing, right? Doctors who treat chronic Lyme are considered, you know, quacks, right?
That's the word they use. They're quacks.
Right. This is the way, and this is the way they approach anything that's away from the mainstream. And the same thing happened with COVID, right? The same thing happens in nutrition. If you look at nutrition, we've literally published studies of people's type 2 diabetes reversing, right, in a couple of months, right? And what do they call me? A quack, right? And because their minds are so locked in. And I wasn't any different. You know, I was a chief resident, and I had to study, I had to learn medicine and like it was the Bible, right? I had to learn it like it was a faith. And anything that deviated from that sort of shook my core, right? And they made us arrogant enough to not really consider that maybe we don't know everything.
You know what I call that? I have a label for that psychiatric condition. It falls under narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, and I call it MD ego.
I call it compassionate deficit disorder, CDD.
Yeah. So what you guys are talking about is basically, and I'm telling you from my own experience. I remember being, you know, sort of the chief resident and thinking, when people come in with chronic symptoms, that it's just like, just suck it up. I mean, I wasn't dispassionate. It was like, I don't know what to do, so just suck it up.
Yeah.
That's fine. Like, I would be fine with that. Like, if a doctor, I have a buddy who, he's become big now in MECFS. Like, he's in the Washington Post meeting with Collins to help start this all off. And I was with him through the whole process from when he first got sick to having MECFS. And I remember coming back, and he's like, this was a guy he'd been a staff writer for JAMA. He'd been a staff writer, medical writer for the Washington Post. So, like, he's not a doctor, but he has a really strong understanding of medicine, and he has physician contacts like at his fingertips. He can call up experts anywhere. They'll return his call. And after like a year of going through all this stuff, he told me, he's like, Paul, these neurologists really don't know anything. Like, and it was just like, to him, it was shocking as a man in his mid 40s, and who had like spent all these decades as a medical journalist, and then realizing this, it was.
Well, let me tell you, it's gotten even worse. So over the last 30 years, there's less and less private physicians. Now the biggest employer of physicians is an insurance company. right? And so what's happening is most doctors are now not independent, right? They work for a hospital system or work for an insurance company or work for private equity who govern how their workload and how they should think, right? So right now it's gotten even worse. So if you think the CDC has been like bad over the last 20 years, which I know, BITTEN, you said something that, Kris, you said something that hit me. It's like, I have seen these CDC shenanigans play out, right? And immediately when I saw this, I messaged Paul. I'm like, Paul, let's get her on the podcast.
Mhm.
Because what you saw was the preamble to what now Paul is basically reporting on. I mean, it's literally the blueprint.
So like, you know, when Kris has these things historically with the CDC, the article that I had just last October, which, I mean, I'll tell you how this happened. I was online and I saw that the second largest PR firm on the planet, Weber Shandwick, had a contract with the CDC to staff their vaccine center. So I'm like in bed. This happens so many, like every 6 months happens to me. I'm in bed, I'm reading something. I should like not be like online doing research, but that's what I'm doing, like as a weirdo. Like, who is this person? What are they doing? Blah, blah, blah. And I see, wow, CDC has a contract with this PR firm. And I'm like, that's weird. And then I'm looking back and I find out that Weber Shandwick employees are like embedded, staffed at the vaccine center for the CDC. And then my next thought was, well, who are the other clients for Weber Shandwick? And by 4:30 in the morning, I've made all these, you know, I've done screenshots, I've done PDFs. Their other clients were Moderna, which put out the COVID vaccine, which they got a contract right around the time Moderna got their COVID vaccine authorized, and Pfizer, which had like I think the first or the second biggest COVID vaccine. And you got to understand, like, I mean, I was so weirded out by this. I'm like trying to go to, I finally fall asleep like 4:30 in the morning, you know, and then I sat on it for like 2 weeks trying to figure this out. And I'm like, how can this be possible? Like what is going on at the CDC, you know? And so then some of the stuff that you were telling me, I'm just kind of like, this is weird, but like, also the stuff at the vaccine center, like, I mean, so like, that's what I could understand. Like, it's just weird to me.
I think it's really hard for people to understand the concept of regulatory capture. So if you look at sort of, the things that Kris, you suggest in BITTEN, this concept of regulatory capture, that the CDC will change like to suit the sort of products in the pipeline. You sort of see that play out. The cavalierness with which the CDC has been with human lives. I mean, we know this from Tuskegee. Nobody got fired. The culture hasn't changed, right? So, but if you look, I mean, it's there for nutrition. It's the same thing. Up until August of 2022 on the CDC website, it said that if you have diabetes, more than half of your calories should come from carbohydrates. And in August of 2022, guess who created a viral tweet that called them out on their bullshit? And guess what happened in 2022? They took it down. They took it down, right? But so what's happened here, I think, is there's a lot of regulatory capture, and they just don't care. They don't care.
I was shocked, and this was actually, there's a British doctor, Asim Malhotra, who's come out.
My good friend, Asim is on.
So he tweeted out something just talking about regulatory capture and like just capture. He tweeted out some tweet, again, like late at night, I should not be, and I see this tweet from Asim, and it's saying, why was McDonald's helping to promote the COVID vaccine? And I was like, wait, what? And then I'm like, I saw it once, okay, this is some weird one-off. So then I start going back and I'm like, okay, like when did we actually know that obesity increased your risk of death and hospitalization from COVID? And I went back and it was like right around February, March, right? Because we were trying to figure out what the response was, and then there was some solid stuff by like about June, I think. Like it was just understood by everyone in the medical community that obesity, because first they thought for a while, why are Black people getting it? There was like, is this genetic? Is it like whatever? And then we realized, okay, this is tied in with obesity, with the higher rates of obesity amongst these people, right? And then the White House turns back around and partners with McDonald's to get out the jab. And there hasn't been a single White House press release that I've seen saying, hey, guys, let's focus on people losing weight because we realize that this is increasing your risk of hospitalization and death from this pandemic. Like that wasn't once, but like, let's partner with McDonald's and the burger and fries people. That was so insane to me, you know?
Yeah. So I think the problem is that it's very difficult for people to understand regulatory capture, right? Like those institutions donate, right? And most physicians have lost their identity. They don't have time to think. They don't have time to question. And they just go to these central planners who say, the mayor of New York said, you can get free French fries if you get a vaccine, right? We know hyperglycemia makes, COVID disease worse. And I don't know if it's noble lies. I don't know if it's intentional. I don't know if it's just stupidity. But it's clear to me that, these institutions can't be trusted completely. I don't want to say can't be trusted. They can't be trusted completely. And would we all agree upon that and sort of end it off here? Chrissy, can we completely trust these institutions, the CDC, the NIH? What would you say?
Can we trust them? I know some good people in the CDC, but it's the bureaucracy that is intractable. I mean, I looked at I thought about the parallels between COVID and Lyme disease. First of all, they have old school disease tracking. The CDC's disease tracking was a disaster. They had epic communications failures. With Lyme disease, there's still bad information on their CDC website on Lyme disease, but they will not fix it. For example, they said urine tests are horrible for Lyme disease. Well, Willy Bergdorfer, who discovered Lyme disease, got Lyme disease from infected rabbit urine that splashed in his eyes. So don't tell me that you can't test for active disease in urine if this is a fact. But it's still on their website that all urine tests are horrible for Lyme disease. Wouldn't it be great if you could have an over-the-counter accurate urine test like pregnancy tests for that? And then there's this group bias revolving door between CDC and NIH and the government, which is just destructive. And then the conflicts, starting with the Bayh-Dole Act, conflicts that Paul has written about extensively, and we don't have full transparency on that. So that's the problem with the CDC. And then with Lyme disease, there's the other thing, which I brought up in my book, BITTEN, which is the conspiracy theory, which is probably true. When Willie was looking for what was causing what we call Lyme disease, he found another organism, a rickettsia related to spotted fever, which is the most deadly tick-borne disease. It's in the North America, and it's the disease that's carried by these lone stars that give you alpha-gal and are aggressive and are taking over deer tick populations. And we're killing people on Long Island. And he was told to cover that up by some unknown person. And so that wasn't in his discovery article in Science magazine, only the spirochete, not the other insidious little virus-like rickettsia that is known to be, it was a known bioweapon that they were jiggering, doing crude genetic engineering with the rickettsias for the biowarfare program. So it was left out of his science discovery article. And so the very foundation of Lyme disease, the research foundation, is flawed because they left something really important out. And so I've always thought, well, when they discovered Lyme disease, why did they say you can cure it with 2 weeks of doxycycline? All the literature from the beginning of time with spirochetes, which went back into the 1800s or the early 1900s, are that penicillin works really good on Lyme disease. So was the Lyme spirochete a misdirection for the other genetically engineered rickettsia that can be cured by doxycycline? So have they made this 2 weeks doxycycline cures Lyme because they know the real perp is the rickettsia that was engineered? So that's the conspiracy theory, and only scientists can prove that. All I can say is this is really interesting and scientists need to pursue this. And also the government needs to release these 70-year-old bioweapons documents from the basement of Fort Detrick, the headquarters of the bioweapons program. So we know what organisms were released, where, and what protective vaccines, et cetera, they developed to protect our soldiers when they were developing these bioweapons. So that's the main point of BITTEN. Why haven't we pursued this other rickettsia, which is just labeled Swiss agent by Willie? He never claimed discovery for it. It was swept under the rug. What is that? He said it was in all the ticks and blood that he looked at in Lyme, Connecticut in 1978 is when he discovered it. So
that's just so fascinating. Guys, get the book BITTEN. And Paul, you want to close us out? Can we trust the CDC?
I can tell you right now, the last piece that I just wrote was based upon documents that I've gone twice to Twitter so far. I have stuff I'm coming out with. One of the things that I ran across was an internal report from inside Twitter where they talked about Anthony Fauci taking over the White House COVID response Twitter account. And when I saw that, I'd read his deposition that he gave in a lawsuit last November. In that deposition, he says multiple times, I've had no interaction with Twitter. I've had in so many different ways. And so my piece is about, why is this guy lying about this? Fauci, he lied multiple other times in his deposition. He lied knowing a guy named John Ioannidis, who's one of the most well-known physicians out there. He's at Stanford on evidence-based medicine. I contacted John. I'm like, John, this guy Fauci doesn't know you. He's like, he was my boss. He knows me. And then he sends me an email where Fauci's talking about like, hey, we all know John, like contact him about this stuff at Stanford. So I don't understand, what's going on with Fauci. He lies all the time, and why, I don't know. And I'll leave you with a very famous quote idea that's attributed to I.F. Stone, famous muckraker. And his quote was, all governments lie.
Got it. I all I can say is I concur. Guys, check out Kris Newby's book called BITTEN. It's on chronic Lyme and the CDC, and Paul Thacker's Disinformation Chronicles on Substack. I'll put your guys' links in the bio. Check out the show notes for their links to their websites and their social media accounts. Thank you so much, both of you.
Hey, great talking to you guys.
yeah.